How much do you remember from grade school science class? Americans' science knowledge, or lack thereof, has been cause for concern for educators for years, and it's also provided plenty of fodder for late-night comedy.
What is our galaxy called? It's also a candy bar.
Mars.
Of course, we know the answer is the Milky Way, but millions of Americans lack a basic understanding of science. In fact, 1 in 4 Americans doesn't know the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. That's according to a new report by the National Science Foundation. And joining me to share more of its findings is WGBH science editor Heather Goldstone. Welcome back, Heather.
Good to be here.
So how did Americans stack up in this test with other countries?
Honestly, not as badly as some of the media reports about this study have suggested. In most cases, the number of Americans who were able to get, there were 20 questions asked, who were able to get these questions correct was about the same as, say, in the EU or in Japan. But on a few key questions, Americans really lag behind. So evolution is one example. So let's look at the results for the question on evolution. People were asked to evaluate whether this statement is true or false. Human beings, as we know them today, developed from earlier species of animals. And you can see that in much of the rest of the world, clearly the majority of people say true, around 3/4, close to 80%. Here in the United States, 48% of people surveyed said that this statement was true, and that's actually a number that's been steady for about 20 years. Just shy of half of Americans say that this theory of evolution is true. But what they did that was really interesting in this case is they tacked on, in some cases, this little statement before, according to the theory of evolution, human beings as we know them today developed from earlier species. So when you give people essentially that disclaimer, the number goes up to 72%. We look a lot like the rest of the world. So yeah, it's not a matter that people aren't aware of the science. They just don't believe it. And personally, I would say I think that belies a real misunderstanding of the nature of science. And in fact, there were other indicators in the report that that's true. Only about 1/3 of Americans could really demonstrate a firm grasp of scientific method. And so I think there's just a real misunderstanding as to how science works and what it can tell us.
Well, you know, one of the questions I saw was about the Big Bang Theory, and it said, you know, the Earth, the galaxy that was started by a Big Bang. And I'm thinking, that's still a theory. But that was a true and false.
Right. It may not be completely settled, but right. Yeah. It was a true false. The numbers in that case are even lower for who said it was true. But interestingly, the same sort of discrepancy was involved there when they say, according to astronomers, the world started with a huge explosion. The numbers jumped up to being in the majority. So again, this ties into some of that religious belief about origins of the planet and of life.
So we recently saw Bill Nye, the science guy, debate who was it? Ken Ham of the Creation Museum, which was a little bit of a controversy because Bill Nye is this very, you know, sober PBS science guy, and he got a criticism for actually participating in it. But I mean, there wasn't really a winner or a loser in that, was there? Because I mean, how can you can't really debate fact.
Debate winners, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder, right? Some are going to say that Ken Ham won because they wanted Ken Ham to win. I'd say most of the analysis I've seen put Bill Nye in the winning spot, in part because they said what Ken Ham was saying just defies what we know to be fact, and he kind of was able to hang himself by demonstrating this real misunderstanding of what science is and what it can tell us. So, for example, in his opening statements, he tried to argue that there's one scientific method that applies to looking at the present, and that doesn't apply. We can't use the scientific method to look at the past, and therefore biblical accounts of the past are equally valid with scientific accounts.
He's like a carbon dater denier, though. I mean, how do you reason with that?
I guess you probably can't. But what you can start to do is there's been a growing body of psychological research that gets at why it is that we lose the ability to objectively look at factual information and incorporate that factual information, particularly when it conflicts with deeply held beliefs. And one other interesting thing in the report is actually we've seen an incredibly large jump in federal funding for psychological research, over a 40% jump over the past 10 or so years. And you know, the thought there is that perhaps some of this understanding of how our brains work and how these beliefs and factual information conflict might help us be able to actually communicate these ideas better and get over that hurdle.
Well, is there a way that Americans can take more of this in and retain it? I mean, and one of the disturbing points out of that study was that more young girls, like we saw there with Jay Leno aren't getting it, aren't grasping it. Maybe it's not popular. Or maybe it's becoming more so. Look at you.
Right. Girls can get science too. No, I think one of the encouraging things that came out of the report is actually that the ability to get those questions right did increase with more formal education. So we're not doing everything wrong in education. I think a lot of it comes down to these psychological barriers, and there's a lot of effort being put into developing better communication strategies. So Alan Alda, who we all love him in MASH, but then went on to do all sorts of great science programming, has now put a lot of effort into this, and he's actually trying to use some of the tools of acting and even comedy to get this across.
And the improvisation that we teach is not comedy improvisation. It's not where you think of new things to say while you're standing there. It's really based on getting people to communicate, to observe one another, read one another's minds.
It's a tough challenge. But like I said, some of that psychological research really can help. And there are ways to become perhaps a more trusted messenger and start to overcome some of those hurdles.
All right, Heather Goldstone, thank you as always.
My pleasure.